Ruben Sellers is a manager who enjoys a high press. It's a system that he's run in many of the teams he's worked with, and it was a system that he was brought into Southampton last season to try and help Hassan Hutel coach. Now, in Harvey Knibbs, a player that he's recently moved inside, he's found a real kindred spirit and a player who can really help him to press, as well as scoring goals, which is, of course, incredibly important. Now, we're going to look today at Reading's pressing machine, whether that's Harvey Knibbs, do a little tactical rundown, look at some screen grabs, and we'll talk about how and why teams press in the first place. So let's head on and look at why teams press. I want you to keep an eye here on where Knibbs is to start off with. So he's over here, and then also Wing and Finley. These are going to be some reference players for us here. So as we look at the next slide here, we can see that Knibbs is beginning his run forward. And Savage is pressing on the throw-in. Now, it's worth noting that a throw-in along the side is a pressing situation that Sellers really seems to like. We'll see a few more of those later on, but this is somewhere that Reading really do like to try and force the opposition into a bad pass, try and retrieve the ball as quickly as possible. Now, Harvey Knibbs making his way up here, and let's move on to the next slide here. We can see that Knibbs has made his way all the way up to the field, and after Savage has made a challenge on the ball but not quite gotten it away, Knibbs is still coming after the player here, looking on the blind side. You can see Wing and Finley here haven't really moved at all, just showing just how far Harvey Knibbs has actually managed to go. And as we move on to the next slide, Knibbs wins this ball back, and Smith, who's standing here, is able to turn, shoot, and score right away. It's a great finish from Smith, but it starts from this piece of pressing along the sideline here. So let's talk about how teams and players press, why Knibbs is good at it. We're going to look into some of the sort of personal player-related things that they can contribute to pressing and why players can be good or bad at it. And then we're also going to look at some of the team aspects and talk about whether Knibbs really is that pressing machine in the Reading FC team. So let's move on to look at Knibbs' stats. This is his defensive stats per 90. I'm taking these from FOTMob today. If you go and look at his attacking stats there, obviously with Knibbs being one of our most productive players on the team, he is pretty high up for those. But on this defensive side as well, you can see he's high up for tackles 1, duels 1, aerial duels 1. He is quite a tall lad. But crucially for the press, he's high up in possession 1 in the final third. He's in the top 25th percentile for that. And he's also a handsome chap, so that's always good. Now, here's a reason why we press, and here's something that we want to do when we're pressing. We want to win that ball back immediately after losing it. Why do we do that? Well, the opposition are often out of their defensive structure in that position. They're trying to get set up in transition to get back into their attacking sense, and they might be going from their, say, 4-1-4-1 in Reading's perspective into more of a 3-2-3-2, a more of an in-possession structure. Sometimes you'll see a 3-1-3-1. But what this means is it might be leaving holes as players are rushing to get into their attacking positions. Teams are vulnerable when they're setting up this attacking shape, and there are other teams in the Premier League and other leagues that do like to use this tactic. Quality of rest defense in League One is really mixed. Some of the teams don't even really particularly do it. And by rest defense, we basically mean what a team is leaving back in case of a counter-attack to defend. So Arsenal, for instance, are a team that do it with a 3-2, where you'll see Zinchenko come inside to play in that sort of 2 in front of the back 3, or at least they did last season. We'd have to take another look at what they're doing this season. But in League One, whether a team can set this up quickly and understand it is a little bit more negligible. Now, hopping back on over here, we're going to take a look at how Knibbs does it from a personal perspective and why he's good at pressing. He's really good at these 3 particular items: arriving on the blind side, punishing loose touches, and anticipation and risk. And really that should be anticipation and acceptable risk. It is something that intelligent players need to be able to suss out very quickly, whether they can risk leaving a man free so that they can go after the person with the ball. So first, let's talk about arriving on the blind side. What do I mean by that? Well, when you're driving a car or when you're taking your test, you are often asked to look around, right, to check your blind side in your mirrors, see, what your mirrors couldn't see. Now, a player, when they're moving on the ball, they're having to focus on where their defenders are, where the press is coming from, who might be behind them. And you would do this with scanning normally, but it's pretty hard to do when you're moving on the ball and you're trying to scan your team as well to find a next passing option. So in this particular play, which is a good example of this, you can see here that Knibbs is taking note of the defender's eye line, which is occupied with Craig here, taking a step to the right. So with Craig taking a step, well, to the right and the player's left, Knibbs decides to go in for the left. So he angles his run to the left slightly, though, to avoid detection. So with that, even if the Wigan player here took a look over his right shoulder, he might not pick up on Harvey Knibbs right away. You want to try and arrive as late as possible with this. And then right at the last minute, he's arriving on the right after feinting left. The player has no idea he's there, isn't able to effectively cover up the ball, and Knibbs is able to win the ball back. Obviously, this isn't in the final third. Obviously, this is a little further back on the pitch than we want it to be, but it's a good example of how Harvey Knibbs is able to sort of press very intelligently. Now, next, let's talk about loose touches. So, Harvey Knibbs is very good at early identification of the likely ball receiver. In this particular case, Craig here has just lost the ball after being pressed by Wigan quite effectively, and he's noticed that the ball is going to come over here. He's starting to make short steps, which will allow him a quick burst of pace. And then, as the player makes a loose touch, he makes a rapid burst of pace to close that space. If you're making those short steps, you can go either way very quickly. It's really good for defenders or people trying to get the ball back, like Knibbs. But it also allows you to burst into your acceleration very quickly when you want to. And here, the Wigan player loses. He doesn't quite get the touch on it that he wants, and Knibbs is able to burst forward and try and make a play on that. And the Wigan player actually fouls him, and the ref doesn't really pick up on it here at the end of that play. But again, this is a good example of probably the most common thing you'll be told in pressing, to sort of make short steps and then wait for a loose touch to really get in there and challenge for the ball. So next we're going to talk about anticipation and acceptable risk. So here we've got a quick free kick being played by Wigan. Knibbs spots the intent here, and he immediately begins moving towards the player who seems to be asking for the ball here. So you can see him here with his hands out asking for that ball. Now, he risks leaving Savage alone with two. Down here, you can see that there are two players, just to Savage. Dorset is keeping an eye on that too, but obviously Knibbs would have been the man who was on the number 9 a moment ago. Knibbs is the person who actually fouled the number 9 here. So he takes that acceptable risk, knowing that there's defense behind him. And then he uses a Hib Hatcherman's move left to press right. So these players are kind of connected here, right? So Hib Hatcherman is covering this side. The Wigan player starts making a really good turn, but because he's covered from both sides, Knibbs is able to get a foot in and eventually win that ball back and spring a Hib Hatcherman for a counter-attack. However, it's no one-man show. As we can see in this particular instance, and we'll go back just one, there are two players here. Pressing isn't something that can be entirely done by one player. Obviously, some players will win the ball back more than others, partly because of where they're placed on the pitch. But it doesn't necessarily, mean that that one player is the entire driving force. So we'll go on. Aziz presses the ball really well, especially in the final third. He's a player who's grown a lot in confidence in the last few months as he started scoring goals, and we've certainly noticed him from that perspective. But would you be shocked to know that he's in the top 10 in the league for balls won in the final third per 90? He works well in tandem with Knibbs, and in particular wing, to cause defenders trouble. He's capable of turning defense into attack in seconds, and we talked about that in the Why Does Femi Aziz Start video. So Femi, as well as Knibbs, is really a player who after a few months is starting to learn from Sellers, starting to really grow in this system, and it does appear to be working for him. So let's talk lastly about forcing bad passes. This is something that you can do as a team. And you can see here a Hib Hatcherman is keeping an eye on this player here, while Knibbs is trying to keep an eye on the most likely person to receive the ball from the throw-in. And again, we're looking at a throw-in along the sideline, one of Sellers' favorite pressing triggers for Reading to exploit. So you can see here, he begins some very aggressive running towards the ball carrier with no hesitation. He runs straight towards this player, and then as he sees that the ball is going straight past, he angles his runner already. You can see he's peeling off to the left to go straight for the Peterborough player. Now, the opposition has to retreat and kick that ball long, and Reading are eventually able to win the ball back on the halfway line. So this is a play whereby, you've got a free player here, you've got a free player, and then the goalkeeper here. But Peterborough, really, with this aggressive running coming towards them, just don't have the time to make that work for them, and they really have to force this bad pass out. So this is why we do it, right? We can score goals, we can force bad passes and retain possession. And Knibbs is a player who can really do it well. But as I said, Reading don't just have one pressing machine. Knibbs is an intelligent and athletic presser, but Aziz and Knibbs are a deadly pair in the opposition's build-up phase. Aziz is another player who can really do well in undersellers, and I think he's only going to keep growing on the defensive side as well as the attacking side. And then finally, Makairu is also getting better as he gets more time in the team. He's not quite posting the same stats as the other two yet, but he is growing into the game and growing into the team as the season goes on. So here's a few examples of how players can press, an example of how Knibbs does it well and intelligently, but a reminder that this is something that happens on a team basis as well as with the individual. Reading are a team that have now had, what are we looking at, 4-5 months under Ruben Sellers, and after a slow start to life, it does appear that they're starting to pick up his methods. So hopefully in the back end of the season, Reading continue to improve, and more players, including Knibbs, Makairu, and Aziz, are able to join in that pressing. But what do you think? Who's the best presser in the team?